Well, good afternoon, everyone, or evening. It's always still. Yeah, let's go with evening. I think last time we settled that. And so, good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for our second Community Budget Review Committee meeting. And we do have our agenda. I believe it was shared in the link, and so why don't we take a quick minute and just do a round robin of introductions, and then we do have an icebreaker today as we continue to get to know each other and collaborate and work through this. So as you introduce your name, pronouns, and role, who was your favorite elementary school teacher and why? I guess I'll
Larson.
Go ahead, Renee.
Mrs. Larson is why I wanted to be a math teacher. She just made math. Well, she probably made education fun, but I remember math. And an example, here's a round glass. So if you she had us measure this. She didn't use these words, but she had us measure around. She told us to bring in round figures, round cans. We brought in 3 cans. She told us to measure the circumference and the diameter. But like I said, she didn't use those words. And it was always 3. So to me, that was like magic. Like no matter what size. And she did other fun stuff. We had to figure out how much a parking lot, new extra parking lot spaces would cost the school. She just did fun things. The year before, it was just arithmetic. And my mother, the reason I remember the story so well is because my mother would tell everybody that I walked around and I said, bet you don't know what happens. And I showed them a round thing. And since then, I wanted to be a math teacher. So Mrs. Larson, wherever you are, Mrs. Larson.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Who else would like to share?
At Hosford, I had Miss Hollister. The thing that I remember most about Miss Hollister was she had us learn how to diagram sentences. Not every teacher was doing that, and as I later learned after studying Latin and so on, those were probably the 2 most valuable things to my career, really, in learning how to use the English language correctly. She also was noted for disciplinary methods of if you got out of line, she'd grab you by the tendon on your shoulder and just pinch it and move you right to where you needed to go. And you probably couldn't do that nowadays, but anyway, it was done in those days. And I don't think even the best student went without getting moved in line someplace sometime or other. So, my name is Roger Kirshner, and I use he, his.
Could I just ask a question? Because we're older. So did anybody else do diagram? You had to do diagram your sentence diagrams. So you did, okay. Really? Alexandra, you did too? Because my younger sisters and brothers didn't even do it. Okay.
I don't know what that, maybe, I can't recall. I don't know. I mean.
Oh, I learned dangling participle and all, yeah.
That sounds familiar.
Miss Dippy, that was Miss Dippy.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Prepositions, you name it, the pronouns and subject, predicate, and so on. So.
Yeah, my children didn't do it. But anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it does bring back memories now. Like, yes, I did that. I didn't know that's what it was called, but yeah.
Technically, I did that. Because for 2 or 3 years of my education, I went to a French immersion school. And so they would have us do things, a lot of obnoxious things. Like we had to write in cursive and we had to write with pens, and we had 3 colors: red, blue, and black, and we used them for different occasions. But I remember exercises where they would have like a sentence and there was no spaces and we had to separate it. We would have to find the verb, we would have to conjugate verbs, we would have to identify the pronouns. So yeah, we did a lot of theory. But yeah, I did do that, but for French.
Well, that's particularly good in foreign languages. If you study Latin, you'll find that, the subject goes at or the verb goes at the end of the sentence and so on. And it's part of the rules of grammar. And my foreign language study, unfortunately, when I was in high school, it was more oriented toward learning the grammar and vocabulary than whereas today it's more learning how to speak the language. So
I'll go next. My name is Hayley Lowry. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm on the school board. I had a lot of excellent elementary school teachers, but one that I always consider fondly is Mary Lamb. That was really her name, Mrs. Lamb. She was my first grade teacher. So this was back in 1983. And I just remember we had all these great manipulatables that we had in class for counting. And I was a very social child, which shouldn't surprise anyone who knows me. So I regularly got my name on the board with check marks after it, and if you got 3 check marks, then you were in big trouble. So I remember my name's on the board and there's 2 check marks and her tapping it with the chalk to make me pay attention so she didn't have to give me a 3rd check mark. But she, having her be my first school experience as someone who was so warm and caring. And we, in the spring, always her class would get to walk to her house for a picnic. And that was a big deal. But she retired 2 years after I had her. And so my sister didn't get to have her, but she just had a love of teaching and a love of her students that made, I think, a lot of us love school because of that. First grade was the first thing I had. We didn't have kinder back in that day. And so Mary Lamb, just a lovely, lovely person and a lovely, lovely first grade teacher for me.
Anyone else like to share?
I can go. I'm Hobbs. My pronouns are he, him. Like I said, for elementary school, I was at a French immersion school for a part of it. So my favorite teacher from there was Monsieur Stefan. And I don't know why. I felt like he was better than Miss Alice. And yeah. And so I didn't really have a good experience while I was in school. I feel like that school was the best school I went to. In comparison, and then he was like the best in comparison to other teachers. But then for PPS, the best teacher I had was Mrs. Francis. She was another French teacher. She was from France. And I had her in 3rd grade. Yeah, I just thought she was like a really good, she was really involved. And she was really caring, I feel like she made a lot of effort. So that was good. I feel like a lot of times we see students see teachers as teachers. And I was listening, or I was talking to Miss Donna, a community member here in Portland who was a teacher, and she talks about how she runs into her former students all the time, but how they can only imagine her as a teacher, right? She had walked into a Fred Meyer once, and she had walked into Fred Meyer with a man, and she had run into one of her students, and her student was like, "Miss Donna, you're with a man, right?" And they were having a hard time fathoming that she's an actual person who they couldn't imagine her outside of the classroom. So what I'm trying to say is, Mrs. Francis, like I could see her, right, as a mother, and just as a person. I don't know. I wasn't in school for that long. I'm homeschooled.
Hobbs, so you have an interesting name. As a political science major, I'm familiar with Thomas Hobbes, but I have to admit I've not seen it used as the first name.
Sometimes I say that I've adopted this name based off of the philosopher. That's not true. When I was 4, I decided that tigers were my favorite pet, and for a year, 2 years, I literally dressed up as a tiger almost every day. I had a tiger suit, and I adopted the name Hobbs. My legal name is Sean Waters, but I use the name Hobbs.
Anyone else like to share?
I can go.
Yeah, go for it, Joe.
My name's Joe Anderson, he, him pronouns, sophomore at Benson. I can't really say, I had a lot of really good teachers. Yeah, I really loved Miss Nelson. She's my 4th grade teacher. She went to high school with my dad. She's just an amazing person. And I felt really lucky to have her for 4th grade.
Well, thank you for
Yeah, it's kind
sharing.
of so I'm Lisa Selman, and I think it's interesting that everybody has mostly it's elementary school, which I would kind of relate to as well. I think my 5th grade teacher, English teacher, Miss Cam, was a stickler for perfection, and I owe her my cursive writing and really pushed me in reading. So I still remember her to this day. So.
I can share, and I just side anecdote. Hobbs, my wife's a teacher, so there's been times where like we bumped into students, and they're like, oh, "You go to Target? Like, you have kid like they're she's a human being, she does this. Who's the man there?" So that just resonated there. Nilberto Elgadillo, Chief Financial Officer. I use pronouns he, him. Mr. Hirschler, 3rd grade, sometime in the early 80s. I can't remember. And just amazing teacher. Considering where I grew up, my circumstances, he was just always so engaging, but more importantly, he was so engaging with my parents. That Mexican immigrants don't speak English. He, white male, didn't speak Spanish, but just make this concerted effort to connect and like just be involved. And so to this day, I always remember Mr. Hirschler. He loved to teach science and talk about all sorts of things. Really like just had this impression on me as a kid. So yeah, hats off to Mr. Hirschler.
My comment is that I'm on a committee with a bunch of kids. I was graduated from college 20 years, but by the time you guys were starting school. So anyway, you're stuck with me, I guess.
Right.
Anyone else like to share?
I can go really quickly. I didn't have a great experience in elementary school, and so it's actually a tricky question for me. But one teacher that I did appreciate was my 4th grade teacher, Miss Barrett, who had a really strong arts focus, and that worked really well for me. And I think she wasn't the most rigorous teacher. We spent a huge amount of time doing art projects in her class, and I'm not, it wasn't so rigorous, and it didn't seem that organized or intentional, even as a student. And then, later as a teacher, when I reflected on it, I was like, wow, she really allocated a lot of time to this unstructured work. But that worked for me. And one thing that I had a good connection with her, and she was really specific in her feedback for me, or like supportive comments for me, and you know, things that she admired about my work or my work habits. And so I think that was just helpful, that connection and specificity, and like, you know, taking my work as a fourth grader pretty seriously. I think that felt good for me to kind of be propped up like that. Yeah.
So Jordan, we're going to put you on the spot. I think you're the last
Oh, I was one of those kids that just like waited as long as possible just to see if people would forget. Like it didn't go. I struggle with this one because I, like Alexandra, didn't have a great experience in elementary school. So there's a lot of like interesting moments I remember from teachers that weren't so great, but I guess if I had to compare them all, I would choose my kindergarten teacher, Miss Giannotti. I just remember, because I think I was too little to like know about all the craziness, but so all I can remember from her class really is just like art projects and like fun stuff and candy. So what's bad about that? So, like, yeah. And then I did tell Alexandra this very interesting story about a fifth grade teacher earlier today. And I was debating whether I should tell you, but I guess I probably won't. But yeah, no, it's had a lot of interesting experiences with teachers. I imagine, you know, if I were to go back in time with my brain now, I would have a different view of these human beings. But as a child, you know, or as a little kid, it's hard to navigate all of that. Yeah, my pronouns are they, them, and I am a confidential executive assistant. Okay. Thank y'all.
Thanks, everyone. It's always nice to build community, right? Community Budget Review Committee. Yes, we got to talk about budgets and there's technical stuff, but as we get through this work, this is one of those opportunities to just kind of get to the crux of the why and like, how do we tie into the work? So I appreciate everyone taking a moment to do that. And so back to the agenda. If you all recall, we did not get to elect a chair or a co-chair. We essentially punted to this week with the hope that there'd be more participants, but I actually think we might be short. So I really want to open it up. Yeah, open it up to the group for discussion, to the committee, to just go through the process and see where you all stand and would like to do.
Have we ever had a leaderless committee? I mean, I'd be in favor of doing that.
Well, I think it helps to have someone facilitate the meetings and set the agendas in collaboration with the staff. And I also know in the past, it's been the chair and vice chair who make the presentation to the school board, but that doesn't necessarily have to be. But we could figure out a different way to do it. But I know it's helpful for staff to have a couple of people as point people to work with, but we could divide up the responsibilities totally.
At last week's meeting, we had on the table was Roger as chair, and then thinking about like who can help with, and I guess the distinction between co-chair and vice chair, I leave you to you all to differentiate accordingly. But thinking about having the ability to connect with someone and for the staff to work with a liaison on CBRC is definitely would be one of the benefits of having a chair to help establish the agenda and some of the topics. And ultimately, if there's a change or want to pursue it differently, I think if the group has a discussion, this is the time to do it.
Well, Roger is willing to be the chair, so we would at least have a chair. I'm sorry. Right? Is that correct, Roger?
Well, I'm willing to chair and preside, and keep the meeting moving. I have that PTA background, and I've chaired a lot of meetings, but also being the longest serving member on this committee, I know historically it's fallen to the chair and vice chairs to be the scrivener of the final report, and I'm kind of loath to do that. I don't mind presenting it, but and I don't mind taking a hand at trying to write something, but from experience, when the committee gets to that stage, it's best that you have somebody who's writing and reflecting the will of the committee, but nevertheless moving things along. Otherwise, it gets bogged down. Like I shared, I think last meeting, there was one meeting that went well past midnight, just in drafting the final report, and I don't want to do that again.
So I having been on the committee last year, I still feel like I'm learning. And I also have some commitments up front through tax season, but I am happy to help on the report side, to help Roger if someone else is willing to kind of help in that regard too. I'd be willing to take a part in that for sure.
Well, I think that Roger and Lisa would be a good chair, vice chair combo. If that, Roger can help with his deep history, and then maybe Lisa can help with writing the report. And it could be co-chairs too, if you wanted to do that and sort of rotate, especially after tax season, Lisa, if that was a better fit for you.
Yeah, I think I'd rather Roger be the chair and I can be the vice chair. And then I also think too that kind of mentoring someone else, because as we all move along into our final year of having some of the new members too, kind of, I know it's a lot to take in and observe. So maybe there's an opportunity for someone who's new to the board to be involved in that regard too.
So it sounds like on the table, we have an opportunity for chair for Roger and vice chair with Lisa. And I think it's just for the sake of putting it on the table, you have staff to support. So as we think about agenda setting and things like that, obviously we can help and get through the process. There are certain things we do need to talk about, whether it's getting ready to the superintendent's budget, the local option levy. There's some critical things, and we can definitely help in doing that. In managing and facilitating that conversation. I think the key work will eventually come down to the presentation to the board in May. I believe it's when CBRC presents their report, and hopefully by then, right, with staff support, there's maybe a better sense of comfort. And to Roger's comment, I'm all for not having meetings go till midnight. So anything the staff can do to help facilitate that and help kind of like move us along, whether it's starting on the report a meeting before the last meeting and just kind of facilitating that so that the report doesn't get generated at the very last meeting. I think those are some options for the committee to consider as we think about the cadence as we go through the next few weeks. And so with that in mind, again, just from a formal process, I would ask for the committee then to take a vote on Roger Kirshner being chair and with Lisa Selman as vice chair. And I know I did that wrong because I'm not an expert on the process. So if there's a formality to it, I defer to Director Lowry.
I was chair of the school board last year, so I learned a lot of the formality. Renee and Hops, do you all have questions or are you voting?
No, I was just saying I'm all for it.
Okay, so everybody who supports the Roger as chair and Lisa as vice chair, let's do thumbs up. Okay, it looks like we've got 3. Roger, and you guys can vote for yourselves. Okay, any opposed? Let's do thumbs sideways. Okay. Looks like we have enough to pass. So Roger and Lisa, thank you and congratulations.
Great. Hops, did you want to chime in? Okay. Yeah.
Just had his, yeah.
Yeah, no worries. Want to make sure to give the space if there's any comments or discussion. So great. With that in mind, I definitely defer to Roger. I can walk us through the next few items, but obviously feel free to
keep on walking. You're doing great.
Sounds good. Appreciate the motivation there. Let's do this. Operating guide. So with respect to the operating guide, last week we received some feedback and recommendations for changes. So Jordan, is this the latest version incorporates those changes?
No, it does not incorporate those changes in this version. Let me pull up Roger's notes.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying
I didn't want to
that.
necessarily,
Wanted to make sure that we weren't assuming the iterator had the changes. I think we wanted to make sure to call out once again what some of the comments were so that the committee can then just do a final walkthrough and then we can bring them back next week as the final version. And there were not additional comments added to it from when we landed,
Nope.
or excuse me, when we closed to today, if I remember correctly.
There were not, and so I'm gonna put in the chat the notes from Roger from last week, and then yes, there weren't any other suggestions or changes. Okay, let's see.
So if you have access to the chat, those are the notes. I am going to also copy and paste it onto our document, our agenda docs. I thought I could do that. I'll ask Jordan.
I'll go ahead.
They can
I'll do that. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep. Happy to do it.
And so to clarify, really, if we think about the agenda item 5:15 at 5:15 p.m., it says adopt our operating guide. Really, we are reviewing the comments and feedback from last week's introduction of the operating guide, and then we'll come back to adopt it.
I must have missed something. I was going to look for my glasses. What are we doing right now?
Reviewing the, I was just going to chime in and say reviewing the comments and feedback on the operating guide. And the notes were primarily from Roger's feedback.
So the notes that were in the chat?
Correct.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. I did do that. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. And if they look fine, then we can incorporate them. If there are any specific concerns, I would defer to the committee to discuss. Otherwise, we can move on.
Renee, just so you know, I also put the operating guide link in the chat. So if you need to look at the actual guide as well, you should be able to see it there.
Norberto, given our previous conversation at the forefront of the meeting tonight, you may, as a heads up, want to talk with Claire because the committee got the distinct impression that she was all for us going home after we rendered our report and not having a role afterward. And whereas I think I'm correct in saying that the general sentiment was that we felt that for major amendments to the budget after its adoption, we ought at least be asked for comment or be consulted or whatever, you know. I kind of laughed last night when you made your presentation and you candidly admitted there were 3 zeros missing in the first draft and so on. And I can tell you historically, we've had boards that as soon as amendments have been made to the budget and there seems to be new revenues, it's like the Christmas tree is gotten lit up and they get gift crazy. So anyway, maybe that's a discussion you need to talk with her about. So.
Yeah, I think I can certainly connect with Claire, and also I think from the perspective of the committee, if it's like I think with our timing, and sometimes when the amendments get done, there is that sequencing of engagement. So like ideally, I'm thinking moving forward as a board reviews and has an opportunity to connect with the amendment, like how do we also engage CBRC if it's happening, because the amendments can happen in September or soon thereafter if there's like some sort of variation. It can happen later in the year. In a previous system where we usually pushed amendments closer into the spring, just to try to like minimize the amount of amendment conversation as we're wrapping up other projects. So it could just fluctuate, but I think figuring out what that sequencing and how to loop in CBRC makes sense in being able to connect.
Well, in fairness, it often is dependent on what the legislature is doing. And if they're tardy in making decisions, the board has no alternative other than to adopt a budget and then immediately expect to have to amend it once the legislature is finally acted. So.
Yeah, I think that, and I imagine it might be a little more kind of wait and see when it's the end of the biennium and kind of thinking about what the next 2 years will look like. So yeah, I will take this feedback, connect with Claire, and then figure out like, okay, you know, what does that look like if there, after the CBRC's report, if there's like a big major change, how do we reconvene to just have a conversation? And on a related topic, since we talked about the amendment, we had a budget amendment at the Tuesday's board meeting, just kind of some background information. A budget amendment is a routine, normal procedure that happens in many school systems across the country. And it's literally the moment that a board adopts a budget, things change pretty much the next day. And whether it's additional funding or, hey, we were anticipating to hire someone on day one, they didn't start until day 10. So there's already underspend. And so you can imagine when you scale that up amongst thousands of employees and over the course of several months, there's eventual changes. And then there's additional revenues. So one of the conversations from Tuesday evening was around the PERS reimbursement. So PERS is a component of what gets funded for retirement. So, right, and the funding from the PERS bond was sitting in an account that felt like it artificially inflated, like the account, but not having the context around, hey, well, that's how the accounting standards mandate that we document that. So it was like a good conversation to just clarify around how much funding is really in that fund. But right, that's the purpose of the amendment, is to go through these changes, have these conversations. Throughout the course of the year, we had reimbursements from FEMA based on some of the COVID investments. And so it's like, hey, now we got to document that because originally it was sitting under stimulus funding, but now we received FEMA funding. So right, there's all that to say is so many changes that happen. And it's common and best practice to try to clean up your budget as you go through the year. And in some instances, you may come back, do another amendment. And so like on Tuesday's amendment, it was really an uneventful amendment. It was kind of course of the year and investments and expenditures. And then there's also Oregon local budget law. So the Oregon local budget law will dictate certain times when you need to make a change, whether a line item or an object or a fund change by more than 10%, or there are certain restrictions like, hey, you're going above a certain threshold for whatever reason, you need to go back to your board and get approval. And so then that triggers an amendment. So there's all sorts of criteria that triggers an amendment. But yeah, all that long spiel was really kind of some context around what a budget amendment is and the process that we go through for that. And of course, if you have questions, more than happy to answer or to, offline or at some point, feel free to reach out.
Well, an auxiliary comment would be that the distinction between dedicated funds and general funds. And last night, your subject, or your at the board meeting, was subject primarily about dedicated funds. So that can't be used for other purposes, essentially. So.
Yep, that's 100% correct. We had specific funds that came in from our PERS bond, and they were sitting in a fund that, hey, the general accounting standards dictate where you put them, but you really can't use them for other things. So as we think about the different funding sources, it does create certain limitations in how you can use it. So it's that's why I have an amazing team. Shout out to my team, our accounting team and budget team, who go through a lot of these processes and really get into the weeds to produce the best reports possible. Okay, so board goals. So one of the key themes of CBRC is to have conversations and sync up on expenditures, investments, and how are we thinking about the board goals. And so for today's meeting, we wanted to just get an understanding or build understanding around what are the board goals. And I'm sure Director Lowry is has these memorized, but we do have a link. And on the link, you can click on that and be able to see what the goals are. And if you give me a moment.
I'm particularly a big fan of goal 2 because that's the one I fought for, the 5th grade math improvements. So it's not like we're allowed to have favorite goals. They're like our children, right? But if I was allowed to have a favorite goal, number 2 would be it.
Well, just to clarify, we're not being asked to consider amending these goals in any way or no. It's just to inform us as to their content, and they have been our base on which recommendations regarding budget. So.
Yep. So as CBRC, here are the board goals, and these are the board goals. And so as we think about the context of our engagement, these are some of these are the board goals to which we focus. And so really wanted to make sure that the committee has access to them, and also a moment to read them. If there's any questions, I'm forgetting that I believe we confirmed for Dr. Renard Adams to join us at next week's CBRC. And so he'll then provide some additional data into adding and just into the map data into our information that we currently have on our students' progression. And so that will help put into context, or further help put into context, these are the goals. So then how are we doing? What information do we have?
So, okay, so these are the goals, and then we're going to get a report with more data, because the last data looks like it was the 2018-19. And so we're going to go from 44% to 60%, but where are we since the 2019? So,
right. So we
we're
had
going to get that data next time.
Yeah, we actually had to stop the measuring. So we paused the goals because during the pandemic, we didn't do the testing to get the data. So we are actually having to do baseline data this year so we can reset those goals. Because we know our students aren't actually at 44% anymore. We know they're lower. And we actually also had specific goals for every year. So the 1920 school year, we had a 3% growth goal, and we obviously didn't make that. And we actually don't know if we didn't make that because we didn't do the spring testing for maps.
Okay, well, that was going to be my next question.
Yeah, so the language in the goals of reading, math, secondary readiness, and post-secondary readiness are still the same, but those specific metrics we have to reset because we don't have information for baseline.
Yeah. And so that's what the note was at the end,
right.
Saying we have to recalibrate.
Yes, but the part of what we do is the CBRC as a committee of the board, right? We call you together, we ask you to do this work. Part of what we're asking you to do is to look at the budget and say, does the budget honor those 4 goals? If that's what we say are the 4 most important things about what we want, to happen for students, is the budget living into that? And so that's part of the work we're asking you to do. Sorry, Hobbs, I saw your hand was up, but I wanted to answer Renee's question.
Yeah. And that's what I was going to talk about, Hayley, because I was at a meeting, and at the state level, they're saying they don't have any decent data for 2 years. That's why I was going to ask. So, okay, I got it now. Thank you.
And Renard, Dr. Adams has a plan, and he's amazing. And the board actually did a work session on the data we do have a couple of weeks ago that you can watch online if you really want to geek out on data stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
When I was reading through it, I noticed that all the goals were for spring 2022. And I was like, so what are the goals for 2022, like school year of 2022 and 2023? Is it the same? And since you need to recalibrate the metrics, like, is it just gonna be okay?
Right. So we were gonna, we had set the goals of this is where we'll be by 22 in 3 years from when we set them. And then what we would have done is, based on where we were, continue to set goals further out. But because we don't have data, and we know, for example, that like our students in math have really declined during the pandemic, we have to get that baseline to reset the goals and say this is where we are, this is where we're going, and this is the time it'll take us to get there. But the overarching goal is still the same. But that data is coming once we have testing, which we should have soon.
Didn't we go over some preliminary information last year that I thought it was reading hadn't declined as much as was anticipated, and I thought similar for math, but maybe I'm mistaken of what
reading
we had.
Did not decline as much as anticipated. Math did decline more than anticipated. And we do have some preliminary data. We do have some schools that did take the MAPS testing. So we have some information. At the beginning of this call, we were talking about small cohort sizes and how that affects our data as well. So we're still waiting to get all of the fullness of that data so that we can set those baselines. But yeah, we know it's bad. And again, not our teacher's fault, not our students' fault, but trying to learn math in a virtual setting just was not helpful for the vast majority of students. What we saw was that students did a lot more independent reading. So, they kind of had to. And so that's part of why the theory is that the reading scores haven't declined as much, because students sort of had to read to survive.
Hayley, maybe Dr. Adams will answer this question, but what effect is the non-testing element having on our scores?
So we use both the Oregon assessment, which is the Smarter Balance Test, or SBAC. It changes names, but sort of that Common Core assessment. And then we also use MAPS test. And so we don't have people opting out of MAPS in the same way that people opt out of SBAC. MAPS is actually something that teachers use as an assessment that helps them kind of change during the year. So students are supposed to take MAPS 3 times a year: fall, winter, and spring. But to ensure that we're not over testing students, if students are taking the SBAC, they don't take MAPS in the spring, right? Because we're like, they should only take 3 tests, not 4. So I think that the people opting out of testing is not as much of a factor, because we have multiple tools. And what Dr. Adams has presented us with is a really great tracking that the MAPS is a very good indicator for how students perform on the SBAC. So you can see the graph of how students did on MAPS, and then he's drawn a line of how students did on SBAC, and you can see that it mirrors exactly, which is fascinating.
So as we ramp up to next week, if you do have questions, we'll follow up with a form, but also, Roger, I defer to you if, as committee chair, if you have a preference in how questions are funneled outside of the committee.
I think we're at a stage where questions could go directly to you and your staff, and by the committee members responding to whatever form you put up, and maybe as we go along, we'll get to where we have a problem where we need to consolidate by channeling them through the chair, and so similar questions are united in one, instead of having staff go down 6 or 8 different trails to respond to each individual. So.
Sounds good. We'll put together.
Sorry. So are we talking about questions that people have outside of the meetings? Is that what we're?
Correct. So if it's tomorrow and there's someone's reviewing, for example, the strategic plan, and they're like, hey, what does this mean? Or any questions, I was deferring to Roger if there was if the chair wanted to collect and questions, or as I was thinking, like we set up a form and folks can submit questions on a form.
Right, because I think, was it last year that Claire would list out what the questions were and some of the answers? Because I think people do benefit from hearing what other questions are.
Absolutely. We would totally share, like, these are the questions. So yeah, sorry, to clarify, it would be an intake, but then we would make sure that the committee saw all the questions and the answers. So we would essentially then publish it for you all. Yeah.
Well, that was one of the other things that because I did put on the agenda, just so everybody knows, on the last piece, asking questions, how we go about asking questions. There are various tools that we can use outside of just a form. If we agree we want to use a form, we can. But just so folks know, we have capacity. We have the ability to use other forms of collecting questions, like a Padlet, like there's a few different ways we can do it. And there are ways that we can do it so that others can actually see the questions all the time. But yeah, I'm just throwing that out there as a possibility for you all. However you decide you want to do it is perfect.
But if there's no preference, we'll come up with a good way to ensure that we have a structured way of taking them in, but also ensuring that there's a structured way for folks to view them and see the responses. Great. Okay. So then the other item we wanted to share is a district's strategic plan, and being able to circle around a lot of the work that's gone into putting this amazing document together over the course of the past few years, and really giving the committee an opportunity to review it, be familiar with it. There's the board goals, but then also the strategies to consider when in attempting to achieve the goals. And there is this just natural synergy between them. And so I think it's also just a critical component of our conversations and the plans and how we consider our investments, to have this in mind as it's part of our conversations when we think about the work we do in supporting our Black and Native students, supporting the board goals, and so wanted to make sure you all had access to this. And I will point out that my favorite page is page 15. So if you're able to access it, it's just a great visual, and it has like a good snapshot of the 4 themes: embracing change, inclusive and differentiated learning for every child, professional excellence and support, and racial equity and social justice. And then within those are strategic outcomes. So it's just a good snapshot and then within those, right, if you double click, there's so much more activity, and which is exciting in ways that it can come together to support our goals. So I do invite you to read all 50 pages if you do have time. If you do not, page 15 is a good summary and provides overview of some of the key outcomes and our themes, strategic themes. Any questions?
I'm a little confused. You referred to page 15. When I scroll at the top, it says 15 of 50, and the title on that page is theme 3, professional excellence support.
Page
Roger.
17.
Yeah, it's
So
17.
maybe 17 on the PDF. Yeah, on the
Yeah.
printed page, I was thinking 15. So yeah, sorry about that confusion.
Okay.
The center of it says forward together.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I got that one.
Great. So one of the other or another item on our agenda was really introduce 2 key funds that are critical to our success, and the student investment account, and then the elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund. So I knew I would remember what ESSER stood for. So, and we shared this information. My goal is to not like go through all of the information, but I think as we want to put these resources here accessible to create awareness. And with a student investment account, this came out of student, I forget the acronym. They see now is going to use an acronym, SSF, Student Success Act, in putting funding and creating funding source to support specific initiatives, specific outcomes for our students who need it the most. And so the document we have here, we have a PDF that shares a lot of the application, or excuse me, a lot of the background and information that went into building the student investment account. And I will also follow up and share another PowerPoint. We did a presentation to the board in November, providing an update on the latest with the student investment account, our progress, and inclusive of that, additional details on the funding, because we're required to submit quarterly reports to the state on our progress towards achieving our narratives or our goals that we identify, and inclusive of how are we leveraging the funding and a variety of buckets. So we do have that information available on our website. But let me pause. Hobbs, I believe you had your hand raised.
So I watched the infographic, and that was really helpful, and I was able to be familiar with a lot of the different funds and how funding is allocated and how it's obtained, whether it's at the federal level or state level, or how the state allocates funding to the different districts. So I feel I'm pretty informed in that area, but I was curious because I see, and in the infographic you talked about, I should say, the moving forward plan. And then, I see the board goals, the 4 board goals, but I'm curious to see if there's like a budget in terms of not like where funding, because there's like different there's different funds, right? And they have different requirements in terms of where they can be allocated to, but I'm curious, are there some budget items that are targeted towards achieving some of those goals?
Yeah, absolutely. You're thinking of like the direct correlation and seeing that through line. So with our student investment account, we do have that on our website. I don't know if it's on the link, but we talked through, when I said the link, I meant the agenda. But I can certainly collect that, and it's on our SIA website, where we have our narrative and like what it's aiming to achieve. And so when we think about our general fund, with the general fund, it does get a little trickier, because the general fund supports essentially all the activities in the district. So as an example, if our general fund is $775 million, that's a huge amount. And if 51% of that is supporting about 80% of it goes into people, but then about like what are the roles then that those individuals are doing, right? And so when we think about um, about 70% of that 80%, I need to double check that statistic, but is at school sites, then one would assume like all those dollars that are going to our schools is supporting achieving our goals. So it gets a little difficult to find that through line to say, well, the money you're investing on in third grade or in 10th grade, how is that supporting the goal? Like, well, right, we have teachers, we have counselors. By default, as a community, there's this engagement to support achieving those goals. So it starts getting a little difficult to differentiate that. When we get to the student investment account, we get to some of our other funding sources like title funds that are a lot more targeted. It's easier to then say, you know what, this funding says you can use it this specific way. So it's easier to connect that than to say this individual is being funded by Title I dollars. So they need to work at a Title I school. They're supporting our students with the highest needs. And then there's like this correlation to they're working with students that need assistance to improve reading proficiency. Or there is an investment with student investment accounts to hire additional programs or additional resources, so acquire additional resources, which could be people, time, or money, to achieve post-secondary readiness. And so then from there, that's like, okay, SIA dictates this. We're investing in this group of resources, people, time, money, to then support a college and career ready program or some of these others. So there's an easier through line. But there is a component of the general fund that's part of just supporting the bigger system. It includes our bus drivers, and it includes our custodial teams. You can make the correlation, hey, a clean and safe campus allows to then create a safe learning environment so that our students can then improve their scores. But that direct association tends to be a little difficult as we think about that. But with our SIA investments, we do have a lot of that information, and there's still room to improve. By no means is everything accounted for and everything aligned in a perfect matrix and cross map, but we want to be able to do that. And Hobbs, I don't know if you're raising your hand again, or yeah.
So this is another question that's kind of similar. So like in terms of like the board goals, and I'm thinking of like the reading proficiency, and then like the proficiency in math, and the 8th grade graduation portion. Okay, so all of I was thinking that maybe it was only 3, but all of the board goals. Is there like does some of the budget go to? So, and this is a question, and then I have a follow-up question. There is a district-wide prescribed curriculum, right?
It's being I said there's components. I know the Laura's like, no. Did we roll out math this year, or is that next year?
We did roll out some of the math curriculum.
Some. That's why I was like,
yeah. PPS has not had standards-based curriculum for about 20 years, and so we are in the process of correcting that.
Okay, because I was going to ask, is any of the PPS budget, is it allocated towards like supporting the curriculum in terms of like resources for the classroom or anything like that? Because I just wanted to see, like, in addition to like the information of some of the funds like SIA and like Title, and there's a couple others, Title I, Title II, and there's a couple others. Is there like a part of the budget that supports the curriculum that would also maybe help achieve some of those goals. I was just curious, and if there was any documents that we could look at.
Yeah, there is. And a huge shout out to our voters who approved our bond measure to allow for purchasing curriculum and acquiring a curriculum and implementing a curriculum. So I don't know the number off the top of my head, how much of the curriculum, but in our budget book, we have information there that ties into our bond services and like what those bond dollars are going towards. And in addition to that, we have the Bond Accountability Committee, which is another entity that reviews like the expenditures and the plans and the associated efforts there. And that's part of this big effort, that why we're able to do this is that we have this dedicated funding source to help provide our curriculum and get us up to speed. If it's been 20 years, and putting us in a place where we can then have that adopted curriculum.
Okay. If there is anything like that, could you send it to me?
Oh yeah, we'll get the documents off our webpage and our website, and we'll send it to the whole group.
And then yeah, I was gonna say something else, but never mind.
Well, you remember, just raise your hand. Let us know. Other questions? Roger.
I just discovered where raise your hand was. I'm getting used to the new screen that's in front of me, and I apologize that I've chimed in without finding it before. One of my great interests is in whatever we're expending on whatever purpose, whether or not we're ever evaluating whether we're achieving the purpose for which those expenditures were made. And the other observation I would make was that the last bond that we went to the public for and they passed was the first time we included other than capital expenditures, like you had just identified, the curriculum development and so on. And as a volunteer in a high school, sometimes curriculum it moves at a snail's pace, and teachers are way ahead. And thank God we have Xerox machines, or because they're in there using them all the time. So.
Well, thank you for that conversation. The other item that we have is our ESSER funding, our stimulus funding. And with our recent amendment, we have some updating to do on the PowerPoint that we shared. And we also have this information on our website. And really, the critical component here being around its one-time funding. So as we think about one-time funding, how do we then leverage one-time funding to support whether it's safe operations of schools, addressing student learning needs, any sort of additional technology supports. And so as we think about the horizon over the next 2 years, as which is that requirement of having used these funds, how do we then support our goals? How do we then use these funds to support that? And so that's part of the ongoing conversations and part of some additional engagements we'll be doing over the course of not just the next few weeks, but over the course of the next year, in continuing to get feedback around opportunities and innovation around leveraging the funding to, and I say innovation, but really like some of those critical activities and supports, knowing it's one time, to then help move the needle on our goals. Roger, did you have a question?
I just looked up and I saw that I had left my hand up there.
Okay.
I just clicked it off. So
Wasn't sure if I missed it and then you changed your mind, but yeah. And so with our ESSER funding, there's been this interesting component with us holding some funds as we wait for clarification from FEMA. And so we do have funding to support initiatives over the next 2 years, but then also there's another set aside of funding, like, okay, is FEMA going to reimburse us for these activities? Or are we going to have to use ESSER funding? And so then if they do reimburse us, then great, we have additional ESSER funding. So that was like a big component of this recent amendment, was some of the recent refunding or reimbursements from FEMA to then allow us to continue to move forward with other plans. But ESSER has also been instrumental in standing up our online virtual school, online learning academy. And so as we think about what the next few cycles look like, how can we continue to leverage these one-time funds? Roger. Yes.
I don't know whether other committee members are having the same difficulty that I have, but I have a difficult time discerning the difference from the 3 different pots of ESSER funds and their purposes, and then from my experience on the committee, I've learned that there's great danger in one-time funding. If you misappropriate their use and create an ongoing liability, and you only have one-time funding.
That's part of the board direction to our staff, is to not use the one-time funding for things such as staff, right? Because we know that in the staff, in some cases, yes, but that we really need to be careful not to create systems and spaces that will actually cause more harm down the road when we lose that funding. So that was a decision, as the board, as the body that directs the budget, made that choice.
The term we've used is the fiscal cliff. And so thinking about the fiscal cliff that these one-time funds present. So, and it's an ongoing conversation nationally. It's not just as you think about other systems that have 10 times, 4 times as much as we've received in funding, and being careful there, like, okay, well, maybe this is temporary capacity, this FTE to support certain functions, but knowing that when then the funding goes away, the role goes away because we've accomplished our task. or getting back to like the online learning academy and ramping up, buying software, hotspots, and a variety of other things to get us to where we need to. And Roger, to your point regarding the distinction between the 3 funds, it was a little confusing early on, and recently, well, I say recently, maybe I recently saw it, but there was some additional guidance that came out that really now adds more clarity around what you can't use the funding for. For example, the last round of funding, ESSER 3, it has this very clear directive that 20% of it must be used for research-backed strategies that help improve, that are focused on learning acceleration. That wasn't the case with the first 2 funding rounds. And so and that's the intent of the U.S. Department of Education, to really push on thinking about transformative strategies to support learning recovery. And if there aren't any other questions, We did put some resources there from the state as well. So if you think about how's the state managing this, because ultimately the U.S. Department of Education relies on the states to then oversee the use and implementation of the ESSER funds. So we then report up, submit plans to the state, then reconcile, and then they submit their information to the federal government.
I had my hand up.
Yes.
Just to make a comment that all of that you have shared, Norberto, is good from my perspective. There are historically some unfunded mandates that come out of the federal government as well as the state government, and they have ongoing fiscal ramifications. One of the most egregious, at least from my point of view, is the funding that goes to fund our special education efforts. When it was enacted, the federal government promised to pay 40%. They've never exceeded 10%, and yet, but they've enacted maintenance of effort requirements and so on. So whatever we expend, we have to continue expending and so on. So, so all these new requirements that come through ESSER and so on, I tend to have a wary eye lest we fall into the fiscal cliff again.
Thank you, Roger, for that. Yeah, it is. We need to keep keen eye to some of these sources, funding sources. Yeah. Yes, Renee. You are on mute. I'm sure it's a profound statement.
Okay. So I have a question about the ESSER funds also. I don't know if it's the ESSER funds or the the SSI or Student Success Act, but I do know when I've read about it that we're supposed to have community input. And my question is, how do we get this community input? Is it like we did for the Student Success Act when we had it at Roosevelt and Fabian and et cetera, et cetera? Or, and if so that is also in the budgets?
So yes, and part of the ESSER funding getting back to being supported and managed by ODE, or the Oregon Department of Education, one of the requirements and directives was around like the community engagement component. And what supported us in this process, when I talked to my peers across the country, as ODE talked about this, was like with ESSER, the student investment account required a lot of community input. There was a lot of initiatives, a lot of great ideas that came out of that, and focuses that the community wanted these investments to go towards to. And so ODE provided guidance with the ESSER funding to say, hey, districts, leverage that feedback as you and to build out your plans. Now, with ESSER, the first two rounds were really about focusing on safety and operational needs. And so there really was like, how do we like thinking about getting to a point of innovative or transformative strategies. It was a big focus on we just need to get through setting money aside to shift classrooms, get masks, do a variety of other things. And now with the third round, this final round of funding, back to specific components that differentiate the first round from the second round to this third round. That third round also included a component of more intentional community engagement. And one of the areas that they called out for, they being the federal government and the state, was to receive specific community engagement, primarily from the migrant community and our incarcerated youth. And our federal funded programs had focus groups and engaged in that activity to get feedback around, hey, we have this one-time federal funding. How can we continue to support your needs? And this was rolled up in part of a report that was shared with the state as a requirement. And the next phase of that is to continue these conversations. So for example, on my calendar and during the month of February, we have a few meetings scheduled that are being managed through our Indian Ed department, our
ESL.
ESL, yes, thank you. And so as we continue these targeted engagements with folks, we're also going to be getting to a point of also getting additional feedback through like surveys, similar to what happened with SIA several years ago. But with leveraging all the work that happened in SIA, a lot of that is supporting some of the work that we're focusing on with the one-time funding. So it's like a yes and in the spirit of like the feedback and directives of being targeted and having these focus groups with some of our underserved communities.
And thank you. And when you use the term safety and operational, so does safety include the safetiness of our students who are being harassed for whatever reason? Or is that under safety?
That would be under social, emotional, and mental health services. And so when we think about the type of investments that can happen, that's part of the gathering feedback and ideas. Although I will share that our student investment account, the SIA funding, supports a lot of those components. So with SIA funding, that's like ongoing funding, and that was part of like the big community engagement. And there's specific narratives that talk about adding social workers, adding additional supports, working with our community partners, our RESJ partners, and other, and by RESJ, I mean our racial equity and social justice partners, to provide these additional supports. So a lot of that is built into the student investment account and the plans and activities that are supporting those efforts.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Roger?
My question is, any of these new funds doing anything to deal with the homeless student population? Historically, PPS has bounced around 1,300 to 1,500 students homeless, and given the amount of homelessness that we see on our streets and so on, I'm wondering if the current COVID situation has exacerbated the problem even further, and so on. So,
with these specific funds, with SIA, I'm not sure, or I don't believe with ESSER, we've invested in specific strategies for our homeless, houseless youth. However, we do have our McKinney-Vento funds that are targeted to support our students who might find themselves homeless. And so I don't know the amount of our McKinney-Vento funds off the top of my head, but there is this dedicated fund to support, and I'm sure it's probably not enough, like in many circumstances. And I'm just thinking out loud of where it would be called out. It would be in our special funds category, which is a few dozen pages in our budget book. But that's also something we can pull out as well as a resource to help share. But we do also have McKinney-Vento dedicated area on our website to help share some of the additional resources and supports that go into supporting our homeless youth. Other questions? Yes, Hobbs.
This is my last one, and this one was also kind of backtracking a bit. But so for the final goal that I didn't mention or didn't explicitly ask about the post-secondary readiness and ready for college and career goal, was there any material there? Because when I was looking at the goal, it talked about like, okay, so here's our metrics for like saying or deciding that, oh, these students are ready. But is there any, is there any material that says like, oh, here's the strategic plan for that. Here are the people that we're deciding to employ. Here's the programs that we have and are going to be investing in. Just some materials like that.
I'm
Dr. Lowry? Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So we actually have a really awesome strategic plan. And at the last board retreat on the 18th, we got to see the WIRE framework of how that's going to be monitored for the public. And so all the pieces and the strategic plan is, of course, built on those board goals and the vision. So what I really appreciate about the leadership team is the board goals, the vision, the strategic plan all line up so that we can really clearly say, here's where we're going and here's how we're getting there. Here are the resources we're using to make that happen. And you were talking about the middle school grade. Is that the one, or the high school goal?
High school.
Okay. So what I will say about the middle school, though, is that right now the placeholder evaluation for the middle school, the post-secondary readiness, is the SBAC, the Oregon assessment test. But the board's intent, and we've talked to the superintendent, and of course he's on board, is to have a portfolio that students would create. But we're doing a middle school redesign. We're redesigning the middle school curriculum. So we don't want to create that portfolio until we have the full robust middle school curriculum. The same sort of thing is happening with our post-secondary goal of looking at, we recognize that all students are different. And so we want to create empowerment and respect for all different paths that students choose after high school. So that's why there's the CTE path. There's going to be an arts path. There's the seal of biliteracy. We're also going to add the seal of multiliteracy because we do have some students, especially like refugee students, who end up speaking, let's say, one language and then also learning English and then learning a world language and ending up triliterate. And some students come to us with multiple languages already. And so all of those pathways is how do we invest in and resource. One of the things the superintendent has worked really hard on is making sure our arts pathways aren't broken. So like a kiddo who goes to Jeff didn't used to be able to be in band. So they could be in band in middle school and in high school, but they couldn't be in band in middle school and elementary school, but they couldn't be in band in high school. So making sure we have through pathways of art, of CTE, of language, so that students can be successful at establishing those pathways, if that answers your questions. And I know Norberto had an answer as well.
Not as eloquent as that one. I was going to add that one of the key funding sources to support a lot of the post-secondary work and high school work is Measure 98. And so that's something we can also share some additional details on. But with Measure 98, it's also, again, one of those very targeted funding sources that says, hey, support high school. Here's some money. This is what you can do. And so we have an amazing team that's putting a lot of this work together or putting it into action to support achieving that goal. Other questions?
Thank you.
Sure thing. Well, I love the conversation, very robust dialogue. And Dr. Adams will join us next week. And so I'm sure there'll be plenty of robust dialogue as well. And so the last item we had here is more of a technical conversation around mechanism for setting the agenda. We talked about asking questions, so we took care of that a little earlier. But as chair, Roger, do you have specific thoughts? Like, is this something that we want to set the agenda as a group here, or give people time, or Roger, you work with us with staff to coordinate, or just kind of throwing ideas out there as the committee, how they'd like to set the agenda?
I'm all open to committee members asking for specific items and letting us know, and then I'll be glad to work with staff and put them in the order of priority of our discussion. I think I shared last week as with a PTA background. I'm notorious for starting meetings on time, and so by all means, if you're planning to participate, be in the queue at 5 minutes before the meeting is to start, because we'll start it on time. So other than that, I have nothing more to say.
I will just throw in there, just as everyone, all of you are thinking about how you want to bring the agenda together, that typically we need to post these a week in advance on the board website. So just keep that in mind, however you want to bring this about. And I'm happy to work with whomever on putting that together and making sure the board that it gets posted.
So I know our public notice is only 24 hours, but we have a 7-day requirement with the board.
Yeah. So it's actually not a requirement. It is 24 hours. You're correct, Roger, and I should correct that. The week is really to the benefit of the staff who are posting it. So technically it's 24 hours, but we like to get it to them a week in advance just so they're not caught. Yeah.
So I think the rule is that, we need to publicly notice a meeting a minimum of 24 hours in advance, but that having the information that we're meeting, and especially having the materials out ahead of time, is super important to make sure that people can do their work. So on the board, we have to have all of our materials the Thursday before, so that folks can spend the weekend reading and asking questions and preparing. Now sometimes we get stuff late because that's the nature of life. Something pops up, but our staff works really hard to get us stuff on Thursday, so we have time. And the same thing with policy committee and other committees on the board. We try to have it ahead of time so people can know what to expect, have the agenda be ready.
Well, Hayley, I'm curious as to your remarks there. I understand that the board has gotten their materials ahead of time, and but I have yet to be able to access those materials until the public notice has been received, and sometimes those are 24 hours right on the button.
Well, I think that that's a good question for Roseanne. I do think that when it's a public committee like this, it's a little different, but the board, and there are times when board members do get materials late, like 24 hours in advance. So I know that the plan is always to have it out. The earlier we have it out, the better that is for both the board and the public. The legal requirement is 24 hours.
So then it sounds like we'll connect with Roger. Staff will work with Roger to set agenda. Obviously, if the committee has topics, they'll share with Roger accordingly to then help us fine tune and refine the agenda over the next few sessions.
And just for the staff's information, is I volunteer at Franklin, and I'm there at 6 a.m. every day, and I'm usually leaving the building about 10:30 in the morning. But if I can be contacted at any time, really, on my cell phone is there. So.
And Roger, it'll likely be you and I. So if feel free to reach out to me anytime about this. You know, you got my contact info.
Okay. So we are at the end of our meeting. If there are any other questions or comments from the committee before we close out? Lisa?
So when do we get a draft of the budget? Can you remind me when that comes out?
The budget will come out, it is in April. I believe it's April 26th when that will be proposed. And although I believe we have a working session a few weeks beforehand with the board. I think CBRC and board get together, but we can confirm those dates as a follow-up and share. So there is a opportunity to a working session with the board, and then subsequently the superintendent presents or we present the superintendent's budget in April.
It looks like it's the 15th of March is the working session with the school board.
Right. That sounds right. Yep.
And is that likely to be a virtual thing, or are we going to be up in the Mazama conference room or whatever?
I don't know. We can follow up. We've had hybrid meetings. Some have been in person. Community provided input virtually, but we can continue. We can check in with Roseanne and get that squared away.
Well,
depend on our protocols at that point too.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
But from experience, from an outsider following the board, I can just say that when a committee goes into breakout sessions, the public is locked out.
I do want to point out, because I'm not sure if we missed this earlier, but and Alexander and I kind of just added it on here at the last minute, but the budget calendar is in the agenda. And so that'll have a lot of key dates as well that you'll want to pay attention to. I can't remember if we brought that up earlier.
Thank you, Jordan. Other questions? Well, thank you, everyone. Oh, yes, Roger.
I'll close with saying that yes. I'm really pleased with the staff report, our staff support we're receiving, and kudos to your staff.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm very lucky to have an amazing team. So, and grateful. Well, on that note, hopefully you all enjoy your Thursday evening. Thank you so much.